All right, 9:02. I think we should get started. So, good morning, all that have joined us here in this bright early Thursday morning. Unless you're a facilities person like me, in which case you've been here since 7:30. But my name is Brandon Chandler. I work at Temple University, and I'm joined here with my two illustrious colleagues, Shana Alston and Olin Garrett, people that I work with and respect mightily. And our idea here was to give you our glimpse on what happened when we closed, opened, and kind of closed up again a little bit. I know there's a lot of schools in the region that are trying to decide what they're doing for spring. Some of you are like us and are managing day to day, and others are waiting with bated breath to see if January provides you with some opportunity to bring some students back to campus. So hopefully some of the stuff we'll talk about will give you some confidence in what you've already decided to do or are working on, or helps you consider some things that you might not have done yet. So Temple kind of took the lead on some of this and went first, and hopefully this is helpful for you. A quick overview. So this was designed to be a kind of a Q&A with between me, Olin, and Shana. But some of the things that we're going to go over. First thing is there will definitely be plenty of time for questions. We're not going to be talking the whole time. Our moderator, Jackie Sotero, who no one knows, I'm just kidding, is going to be keeping track of our questions. So if you have questions along the way, if you could put those in the chat, Jackie's going to collect them, and then we will dive into all of those at the end, or maybe even in between if it makes sense. So just to overview what we're going to talk about, I'll have Shana and Olin introduce themselves because they could probably do it better than I could. We'll talk about the timeline of what happened here at Temple, and then we'll go through student support, some staffing issues, a little bit of facility stuff, because otherwise I would have no reason really to be here. A couple of special topic areas, talking about the future, and then a bunch of things in the lessons learned category. So, Shana, can you start us off? Tell everybody who you are.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Shana Alston. As Brandon said, I serve as the Director of Housing Operations here at Temple University. I've been in this role since July 2018, and it has been a whirlwind and a roller coaster. Any analogy you have for up and down since I took on the role. I've been at Temple for 7 years, and yeah, I think that's good.
And Olin, sir.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Olin Garrett. I'm the Director of Residential Life at Temple University. I started in February, late February, early March 2019. So I've been here about 20 months now. Have responsibility for the residential education, student support, desk operations, conduct, etc., elements of the department. Shana talked about the roller coaster. I feel like we are on the third downhill loop heading into the twist again on that roller coaster, and it's been an interesting and amazing ride. Good to be with you today.
I think I'd liken it more to we've gotten on 3 different rides.
Yeah.
Batman, you rode Batman and Robin, and then now you're on whatever that new scary one is that no one has really tried yet. I'm Brandon Chandler. I'm the Associate Director of Operations and Maintenance for Temple Housing Facilities, I guess is what we're calling ourselves now. I started here at Temple in May of 2019, so I'm however many months that is now, 12, 14, 16 months or so. I am responsible for our maintenance operation here at Temple, so I oversee all of our facility staff. A bit about Temple's housing structure. So the University Housing and Residential Life Department is made up of, I guess I'll say, 5 elements. So Shana has the housing and operations components, which is, I guess for lack of
HR and housing.
HR, housing, operation, assignments, billing. Olin mentioned that he has the student support, the residential life end. I have the facilities end, so housekeeping and maintenance is in my area. We also have a finance team and an IT team. So there are 5 different areas, and we kind of come together to make the one operation work. One thing that I wanted to do to provide a little bit more context before we go into the timeline, sorry, Shana and Ola, you didn't see the slide, was to talk about geography. So Temple's housing program, Shana can correct me on the numbers. We've got a lot of buildings, and these are the buildings that Temple owns and or has a significant presence in. There are also a couple of other properties where the university has master leases where we're renting space. But for context, from the blue circle building on the top left down to the blue circle buildings on the bottom right, that's almost a mile. So when we're talking about moving people around and doing different things, there is a spatial geography component that has to be considered as well. We are in the middle of North Philadelphia. So there's students spread across the better part of a mile from the top end of campus down to the southern end. And that still doesn't include our building down in Center City where some of our graduate students live.
Brandon, can everybody see this? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you got it. We were about to do the same thing.
I don't think everybody can see the slides. I feel like it's still like in.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's not like in presenter mode. Like they can't see the slides that you're on.
Well, that's not right.
So it still looks like you're like looking at it on your computer with all the slides on the side.
Yeah.
Well, let's try and fix that. I'm so sorry.
There, yeah.
Is that right?
We're seeing your presenter view.
Oh, well, that's not what I want.
But you could definitely see more in that one. Sean can correct me if I'm wrong. Sean is my associate director of housing operations as well. We have 11 buildings, and 3 of them right now are affiliated housing. So those are P3 entities that we are leasing spaces from, and students are on a contract. Oh, well, Beach, I always consider Beach one of ours, but yes, 4. That we are leasing spaces or leasing the entire building, and students have a contract with Temple and are housed in those spaces.
Here, is that better? Are you still seeing the sidebar?
Still seeing the sidebar.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep going for time's sake. I don't know how to fix that just at
That's fine.
So the next thing up, we wanted to give you all a timeline view of what happened here at Temple starting back when we closed up. So I'm going to ask Olin and Shana to take this part over and kind of talk through what happened here from the beginning of COVID through now.
Sounds like a plan. I think we all have been dealing with this whole phenomenon that is COVID since right around the beginning of January, but really jumped into it around the end of February, beginning of March. That same situation happened for us here at Temple. In fact, we can go back to the day February 28th. I think we can mark it. Shana probably knows where she was that day. I certainly know where I was. That was the decision that was the day the decision came down that the university was closing its on-campus location in Rome, and deciding to bring the study abroad and decided to bring all of those students back to the United States. And they were still making decisions about Japan and some other places, but study abroad was starting to see some significant changes. So the first phase of this for us was, how do we navigate and how do we work with housing those students that want to return to campus and want to be able to live in residence halls, but also at that point it was, how do we quarantine those folks for 14 days as well before we enter the residence halls. So that was phase 1. That lasted, this all happened on, we were going into spring break at that point, February 28th. We were in spring break and actually came back. We got back 4 days into the return from spring break, March 4, really right around March 4. the university had made a decision that they were going to do some things. I'm sorry, March 13th, I should say.
Yes.
The university made the decision to close, shut down the operation. We immediately ended up within about 24 hours notice, standing up a move-in process that normally takes about 6 weeks. Immediately asking folks to kind of go home. We stood up a full, like I said, full move-out process, etc. We gave people about a week until March 22nd and said, we'll give you until March 22nd to move out. People moved out in pieces. We then consolidated down to one residence hall at that point. After that point, and really at that point locked up residence halls. We left residence halls untouched, with the exception of those of that residence hall that was open. So that's what ended up happening in March. Shana ended up having to start a housing selection process in April.
Which we had already started planning back in the fall semester. So
exactly, had already started and had actually already opened to returning students.
yes, we opened up our process in December of the year previous. So we had already had the process open.
Yeah. Tried to figure out and start making recommendations about how housing for the fall was going to work. Talking about Q&I, one of the earliest conversations was about Q&I housing. I think we put 3 or 4 different options out that ran into challenges at different points in time. We can talk a little bit further about that. We offered up in May. Shana's team offered up some models for de-densifying and how we were going to work starting at the beginning of May. Right around May 1st, also, right between March and May, many of our folks, we immediately got to an essential status where everybody went home. So everybody pretty much was working from home with some noticeable exceptions. It should be noted that our maintenance staff in particular and our residential life frontline staff, our resident directors, they are considered essential staff at Temple, but the whole notion of what was essential got turned on its head in concept of that. And so we still had a lot of folks working from home. We brought them back around May 1st, our housing operations team is going in, cleaning spaces, checking spaces, etc. We've lost the timeline, so I was trying to figure out how to talk.
Oh, yes. So around that time also, we had already de-densified, the decision was made for us to de-densify our traditional residence halls. Out of the 5 models that we offered, they went with taking our 2 traditional halls off, which is over 900 beds, and making them all singles, would give us about 484 singles. And we were in the process of also acquiring 350 off-campus beds in public and private partnerships. Mm-hmm. And so we were beginning that process of, we were going to go into opening that selection process in late May going into early June.
Yeah. In June, we got to the point where the university started establishing committees, return to campus committees. They had established a executive steering committee, as well as a series of return to campus committees, one of them being student affairs, campus life, campus operations, to be able to make decisions about how to move forward and what needed to happen. One of the interesting things that started happening, though, was that in July, we started hearing more from the city of Philadelphia. One of the unique things, obviously, we have, Philadelphia got the state guidelines that we were following, the CDC guidelines, but we started hearing more from the city. And one of the things that happened in July is the city started meeting with all of the institutions of higher education. And one of the big things that came up was a very, very strong recommendation that the city of Philly institutions hold 10% of their housing for Q&I. At that point, we had not made a decision. The institution had not made a decision about Q&I. We had been going back and forth about various options. But once the city came down and made that call, it was a very quick decision. And I remember Shana's eyes rolling in the back of her head. It was a very quick decision to move from to change the single and de-densification plan from taking our traditional residence halls and turning them into singles. And they went immediately into and became quarantine and isolation housing. And that was a very quick scramble. That was July 15th. 2 weeks later.
So you guys are right. I had to figure out how to absorb 500 students who already thought they had housing. Yes.
Yes, into other buildings. 467 beds got turned over, yeah. We ended up, we also ended up at the end of the month, about 2 weeks before move-in was supposed to start, we got the decision that we were going to test all students at move-in. What originally turned into was going to be a mail test, and then we actually lost our vendor. 3 days later, we found out not only we had a vendor, but we had to do this around the move-in process. And so we scrambled very quickly to try to figure out a testing operation. And we got people moved in August. We were doing well. 2 weeks in, we see a spike in cases in the community, in the off-campus community, that caused the institution to make a decision to suspend in-person classes for a 2-week period. That caused everybody to really do a double take, to really rethink what was happening. It did not take the university very long into that 2-week period to make the decision that they were going to go ahead and stay with the suspension of in-person classes through the remainder of the fall semester. So right by Labor Day. So that decision came September 4th, the Thursday before Labor Day. The university gave until the 13th for individuals to leave. And if they decided to depart the residence halls by September 13th, we issued full refunds for room and board retroactive to the beginning of the semester. And we can talk a little bit about that decision as well. Once that process ended, we had about 2,200 of our 3,600 students take us up on that, leaving us a very small group. We actually entered a consolidation process that actually just ended a couple of weeks ago. That actually ended up happening
A week ago.
about a week ago. So that's our timeline of where we are right now. And we still are awaiting a spring decision. We know that there are some things in the works, but we don't have a definitive answer on that. But we've been making some plans about the break and moving forward. But that's a little bit about our timeline.
We have all our systems ready, all our communications ready. We're just waiting for an answer. So really quickly, to tell you the difference between how we feel like things played out in the spring versus the fall, I would say the spring, we managed it as if it was a crisis. And so Temple does crisis very well, right? Mm-hmm. We are highly responsive and we can activate a team very quickly. And what I appreciated about it, we had one point person who was our director of emergency preparedness, and she managed the different respective teams. She went to the people who were the experts who managed areas on the ground. It was highly collaborative, and there was a lot of trust in people making their own plans, providing that plan to her, and she shared that up with the Board of Trustees and the senior leadership. It moved effectively. We thought, it went well. It was positively received by students and parents. I think the difference between the spring and the fall is that there was a big gap of time. So I said that yesterday about we allowed, we knew this was coming. We knew we had to make a decision in the fall, but as Olin said, we didn't activate any teams, or they created committees in June to make a decision about how we were going to move in the fall and proceed with classes and housing and the like. The differences in this committee structure, they were very big. There was multiple committees, and many of the people who make the decisions, like our facilities team, our facilities director, myself, were not involved in the conversations. So there was a committee about returning to housing, but I was not one of those active players on that committee. And that's where we felt like they had a lot of players, but not all the info to move decisively and quickly like we possibly needed to.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie's taking over the tech part for us because clearly I wasn't doing it right. So if you can move us to the next slide, we're going to dip into student support next. I could have, if I could have you, Olin, to talk about what you and your team decided to come up with to make students feel welcome at home, particularly with virtual community. Now that we knew we couldn't gather together in large rooms and throw parties and things and programming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We made the decision very early on the Res Life side that there were going to be 4 primary principles by which we operated in COVID, and we made decisions about how we were going to work. One of them very early on is that we were going to engage in what our wheelhouse was and what we do really well. We do student support very well. We do individual interaction. We have a residential curriculum at Temple that has very specific goals related to self-awareness, social and cultural awareness, as well as relationship development. We were going to try to do what we could around those particular activities, around those particular goals. So we made the decision to do virtual very quickly. we decided that we would have our RAs go ahead and do virtual community meetings to be able to interact with each other, to be able to focus on individual connections and out chats, to try to connect individuals to the activities that were happening on the larger campus, to be able to connect people to the larger campus community and what was happening there. Conduct issues. We spent a lot of time looking at conduct issues, and I will say that they didn't really gel until actually after the semester started. We started seeing what was happening. But we basically tried to follow the 4 pillars. Our RAs had to navigate our 4 pillars of health monitoring, wearing a mask, checking temperature, those kinds of things. We basically said, if, in order to protect folks, if you left your room, you need to wear a mask. We wanted people to be able to gather, but we said we need to limit the spread of COVID-19. So we altered guest policies so that individuals, and we were pretty restrictive to do it. So people, outside guests, people going from residence hall to residence hall, we actually ended up saying you won't be able to do that. But if you're in the building, you can travel from room to room. Just be mindful of the 4 pillars as you do that. That has been hit or miss. That has been challenging with our students and parents wanting as much of a traditional residence hall experience as possible. We've had some challenges trying to figure out how to navigate that. We continue to figure out how to navigate that in the midst of consolidation, where our responsibilities have now changed as a result. So we modified guest policy. We actually looked at what we were doing with our common spaces. We still have some common spaces. We did de-densify some of our common spaces, but still allow folks to be able to use those for interaction as long as we navigated that. And also made sure we modified some of our policies. We still had to do the rounds and things, but we modified our policies to minimize contact, to be able to do virtual check-ins whenever possible to be able to navigate. So that's a little bit about what we did.
So one of the things I found was kind of, I wouldn't have thought of that. We not only had parents complaining about, well, there should be more hand sanitizer in the buildings, and what are you going to do about spreading COVID? You had people complaining in the opposite direction of there's not enough for my child to do.
Yes.
I thought that was an interesting thing. I thought people would be way more scared about their kid catching COVID and wanting to be hunkered down and not see people. And in the end, you got, how would you say it was a 50-50 split on complaints from the other side too?
I would say it's a very even split, and you crystallized it very well. On the one hand, it's people wanting to keep people safe and saying, well, these people aren't following COVID protocols. What are you going to do about that? But on the other hand, it was, hey, parents' kids did not have a prom, did not have a graduation, did not have any of the special experiences that they really wanted to have. And so come heck or high water, it was really important for parents to give students this experience. And I think a lot of parents went in with the expectation that it was going to be a very traditional experience. And we said we would provide them as much community and as much connection as possible. And we've done that. But the idea is a traditional experience in the context of COVID is very different. I'll give you an example. The health commissioner, about 2 weeks in, as we were making this decision, said, basically, you need to assume that everybody's affected, stay in your room, stay in your apartment. Well, that changed the whole model of how we ended up even doing work, to the point where we couldn't even let people go from apartment to apartment because the city health commissioner made that statement. Carrie actually put in the comment, could you talk about how you allow students to use the common spaces? What we basically did was we identified, we asked our facilities folks as possible to look at furniture and if necessary, remove furniture. We posted limits for the number of folks that could be in those spaces. We posted the guidelines of our university's pillars to be able to navigate having people follow those pillars, but that's how we did it, socially distanced as well. There are some lounges that, because of the function and the way they were set up, we did have to close them. So we used most lounges at certain times, but that's how we did it. We posted occupancy, we posted ground rules, etc. And then it was the honor system in terms of enforcement, and then as the RAs went around, so they looked at it that way.
Well, and there's another question for you from David, but really quickly, I'll just go over some of the processes and policy changes. So just so you guys know, one of the things I said yesterday, and I will echo again, it's really important for you to master and know your housing management system. If my team, so from March to now, my team has had to consolidate twice, open, close twice, and change our inventory multiple times to fit the needs of whatever was the whim of our senior leadership. So having a mastery of StarRes, and I mean our IT team as well as my housing ops team, made us able to be nimble and move quickly. I think we've had more changes. I feel like I know StarRes probably better than I should. So some of the changes, we were told that we were going to close on at fall break, and students would have to go home at fall break. And so we had to adjust our term dates. So we had to lessen the term for fall by 18 days, which translated to about a 15% discount for students. And so we had to operationalize that after our rates were approved and already in the system. We also had to change our contract to add in a clause about COVID. So essentially it says, if any national emergency, any pandemic, anything happens, we can close at any point and not give you any notice. And I think that ultimately, and we can consolidate you and move you at any point. We already had that in housing, but we, in our contract, but we added in a clause that we could trigger that by any natural or unnatural kind of disaster that happens. And so I think that was an important piece. And we added it both in our housing and our dining license. And the biggest thing, and I think that Brandon wanted me to focus on, I tend to be very strict about our cancellation schedule, and that went out the window. Students are still canceling up to this point, and really it's about trying to be supportive of how people feel about their personal health and their self-care. I have an amazing coordinator, Mary Davis, who's in this group, who does our cancellations. And it's really about how do we show families and students that we're supportive of what they're experiencing, and not make people jump through hoops to actually be released from housing. And that is something that we had to advocate for with our senior leadership. People have told me, we need to hold people to the contract. And, in my mind, I felt like, how can you do that? We're changing things every day. We told them maybe you can live here, you're living here, and now we're making people move. And so I think that's something as a department that we committed to. This is our value of being, highly responsive to customer, experiences. And so that's one of the major things that we changed.
Before we move on to talk about staff, one question for you, Olin, which of course I already know the answer to, but you mentioned about addressing conduct, and I wanted to talk a little bit. I remember in the summer when we had our early arrival athletes start moving in and over in Beach, and we were starting to get complaints from staff and other folks working in the building about their adoption of the public health pillars and wearing masks and things. Can you talk a little bit about how you guys navigated dealing with that particular group and how that's been with that group since that time?
Mm-hmm. Well, what was interesting about that group at that time is what athletics was trying to do was to bubble that group in for the summer and get those folks in so they start doing workouts, voluntary practices, etc. The student perception actually was that was going to be a time for them to come in and party. They could go in, come around, walk around, go out, drink, have parties, go put them back to their buildings. We had situations where individuals had actually been opening up emergency exits so that they could get friends in the building. We got to a point where we not only made those conduct cases and had serious conversations, but we had at some points daily and hourly conversations with the athletic staff about what we were seeing and about what was happening. We had an open line of communication to the student affairs person for athletics and compliance officer, who was in contact with coaches. And literally, as we got information about incidents, we were sharing that information with athletics. So the communication was very, very important. We also reinforced messaging in the residence halls, both passive and active, with our RAs, as well as the messaging we put up around the pillars and talking with folks. But I will tell you that was a very harrowing experience, both for us and for athletics, who actually at many points in time turned and said, listen, like we have concerns we have concerns about what they're doing as well. And do our athletes understand what they're about to, the implications of what's happening for them as well?
Great, thank you. If you can move us on to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about staff. And, I think for a lot of folks, this is one of the major pieces, particularly if you're very much still in a virtual working environment, because as you start bringing students back, you can't not have staff in place and doing different things. I'd like each of you to kind of talk a little bit about, what were your considerations, particularly with on the residence life side, you've got RDs living in buildings, RAs living embedded in the community. On Shana's side, you have front offices and student support, front facing areas that needed to be manned in order to deliver the experience that Temple is used to having.
And you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go really quickly. I'm gonna give some credit to my colleague, Sean Killian. We were really smart and ahead of the curve. And I was like, in the beginning, a little like, what are we doing? We went to a customer relations management system called Remedy about 3 years, 2.5, 3 years ago. And ultimately, it allows my team, it's a web-based system that allows my team to respond to voicemail, email, and the like from anywhere. And so what that allowed us to do is we said, so the only issue that we have, because we went virtual from the beginning, like let's say we closed everything down on March 22nd, I think my team was already home like that following week, if not the week that we closed. And Sean, myself, and Dave were the only ones in the office for about a week. And so there could not be an interruption in experience, right? Because like we said, we opened up housing selection in the first couple weeks of April. So it was a very high traffic time for us. So we employed Zoom. Our manager of training development, she set it up. We had breakout rooms. Each of our teams had shifts. We had student workers working remotely, answering emails and voicemail tickets. And we were the only department at the university where you could actually access a person from the time that we went remote. It took most departments a month to 3 months to get back online, including our student financial services. We were the only ones. So as you know, that created a space where we got answers about any and everything that was happening at the institution. Yeah, Olin.
Yeah. There was a lot of staffing considerations on the Res Life side. When we were in March, one of the things that I think was really important was navigating the tension of keeping our staff safe and keeping them in places where they can continue to work remotely. But also, we still had a student presence. We had about 200 students living in residence halls. We had to have staff presence. And our front desk managers are not essential employees. So having to deal with mail for folks that were still there, having to deal with people getting prescriptions, things like that. We still had to have a desk operation. So in March, we ended up standing up a operation where we actually had our resident directors cycle through the residence hall that we kept open, and they actually staffed from 10 to 4 to be able to provide support and man the desk. Now, it wasn't that they were actually needed to have face-to-face contact with people, but there was at least some sort of presence there and hotline in case people had questions or comments or things. As we started to progress into the fall semester, we had to start thinking about changes in occupancy based on the de-densification, based on the changes to housing occupancy. When we moved and made the decision to move our Johnson Hart residence halls to quarantine isolation housing, we had a very big philosophical debate, and it came to a very quick conclusion that we believed that it was not prudent to have staff living in buildings where we could potentially have students that needed to be isolated, students that had tested positive. We had to move all of our staff out. We moved our 2 resident directors for that building to other apartments that we had in our inventory to be able to function. We actually had to realign staffing responsibilities. I think the university, I think the larger campus wondered whether or not we were going to be furloughing or laying off staff in light of that, but because of the way that we had to navigate, we had to realign staff. We had one of those resident directors, was able to have one of those resident directors move into working with our public-private partnerships, and the other resident director, we were able to split a building with very high numbers of RA staff and have two different RAs be able to work that way. Two different RDs work to split and manage staff. RAs were also a very big consideration in this deal. How many, what we needed. We have been dealing with RA issues actually ever since. RAs actually making sure that they have what they needed to be successful, and they advocating for themselves to the greater campus as far as what they needed. They are still advocating now. And so making sure we have what they need. We could not delegate as much as we could at each level. The reality of the matter is there are a lot of things that the senior staff had to pick up that we just couldn't delegate to our frontline staff. One was because we wanted to make sure we had to really think about what the most important role was for them, which was to make sure our students were supported. But also with the ever-changing presence of information, we needed to be nimble and be quick. And that meant that my leadership team had to navigate making a lot of changes to be able to move forward. And then you see the other things that are there: transparency, availability, honesty, vulnerability, etc. I'll say one more note about quarantine and isolation housing, because in the interest of time. One of the things that was interesting, the perennial debate about quarantine and isolation housing is, do you staff it or don't you staff it? And what I mean by that is, do you have presence or don't you have presence? We had set up a situation where our on-call staff and our leadership team were able to manage Q&I very effectively. There is a feeling and an expectation from the campus that we need to have a 24/7 presence in that building to be able to support. And one of the philosophical battles we kept fighting with the campus is, well, if this goes the way it's supposed to, there's not supposed to be that kind of contact, and people won't necessarily see each other. But we have what we need in case people are supported. And so where we ended up navigating in the middle of the road, and we're still trying to figure out a little bit of this, is I have an individual who manages quarantine and isolation housing, has a presence over there every day, and then for special needs, our on-call staff assist with that. So that's a little bit about staff support.
And I'll say really quickly to echo, the transparency and like full disclosure to frontline staff is very important. I think Brandon and Olin experienced it a lot as far as staff being in person. And I will say my team, because they were interfacing with the community so much, my team knew fully what was happening, what we were experiencing, what we knew, what we didn't know. But we also created talking points and FAQs for every step of the process to not only share with our team, but to share with our student affairs colleagues who were manning a helpline essentially for students and families once we got into the summertime. So I do think it's important to prepare your team so they know the scope and the landscape of what's happening, but also making sure they have very targeted talking points so that we are providing the right message.
Yes.
To the community. The provost contacted my office at one point because an email went out that was not shared with our team, and then people were calling with questions, and my team said, oh, we know what you know, we don't have any answers to the question. And literally I got an email saying, you could say it differently, that you don't have any answers to the question. And it's like, we really don't though. So I don't know what you want us to say, but you have to manage the perceptions and answer, and of the institution and how prepared they are and are not prepared.
And let me add this. So there are 3 bullets on the page I want to emphasize. One is we had to spend a lot of time on the Res Life side talking with folks about advocacy and adjustments and what that actually looks like. I think many of them felt like advocacy looked a certain way to them. They wanted certain things. And at one point we ended up having to say, listen, we're going to advocate and we're going to do the best we possibly can to give the best possible situation and the safest possible situation for you to work in. But we cannot mitigate the risk of this. There will always be a risk, and there will come a point where you will have to make a decision about how you operate in this as well. And so it was really a learning lesson to kind of say to them, listen, advocacy doesn't always look the way you want it to. It doesn't always land the way you think it should, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And we were able to provide examples and kind of reframe advocacy for folks. I think the other thing is, I think literally people woke up in the morning sometimes thinking, okay, we are in a place where we're not going to support you. We're not doing what we need. There was nothing sinister. I literally said to my staff, I think sometimes you all wake up and you say, hi, Olin, hey, what is Olin going to do to make my life more difficult today? Or what is Shana going to do to make my life more difficult today? There's nothing sinister about the approach. It's just the reality of the situation. We have, the decisions are difficult, and the decisions are not always visible and they're not always transparent. And so trying to navigate that, I think, was really important, but assuming grace and the best possible intent. The final thing is staff morale. Staff morale is an important thing. It is something to be mindful of. I think what we have all found, both working here and I know I've found other institutions, is at the end of the day, senior leadership, staff morale is important, but senior leadership does not use staff morale to drive decisions. And so we have to be able to say to folks, listen, the reality of the matter is, here's what it's going to take to do something. Here are the factors that are involved. But if we are asked, and we try to advocate as much as possible, but at the point we are asked to do something, we have to position our staff to do it, even if it's a decision in which we disagree.
Very well said. If we can go to the next slide, Jackie. We're going to trim the presentation a little bit because we're running low on time. I'm going to talk a bit about housing facilities because, again, I wouldn't have a need to be here if I didn't. But I think it's an important element, and not all of your operations are going to have facilities, people that control what happens in the facilities and how they get repaired within your department. But I think it was an important element into how we were able to open, being able to connect pieces of information together. But just some general things. So, as Olin and Shana mentioned earlier, we sent our maintenance and housekeeping staff home. So when campus closed, we sent them home as well. And I know we would be on webinars with our APA folks across the country. And while COVID was in full swing during the spring, they still had people reporting as if nothing happened. And Temple, to its credit, really made a good decision here and said, if as many people that you can get off campus, the better. And normally that doesn't include the people who clean and maintain things, but in our case that did. And they stayed out from the middle of March until May 6th when we brought everybody back. Getting them to leave and getting them to even work in that last 2 weeks as campus closed was a challenge in itself because there was so much bad information, fear and miscommunication being shared in the media. And our maintenance and facilities folks are an aging group at Temple. Most of our staff has been with us. I think one of the least serving people has been here 15 years, and many of our people have been here closer to 30. So they have a long history with Temple, but they're also nearing retirement, and they're not on email every day. They're not reading updates. They're not reading CDC guidelines. They're getting all of their information from sound bites on news, and not everybody is watching good news, as we all know. So we had a lot of work to do as far as keeping everybody on the same page. But one of the most important things was trying to reassure everyone that we weren't sinister, like Olin said, that we weren't trying to intentionally put them into harm, but we needed them to do their part safely and as safely as possible so that the students would be served. We could not have, toilets that didn't function or air conditioning that didn't work or bathrooms that weren't clean. Those things still had to happen. We just had to find the safest way possible to do it. For the period of time between March and May, we ran skeleton crews. We had teams of 4 come in every day, one manager come in for a 4-hour rotation just to make sure the buildings were still standing and the water was still staying in the pipes. We did what we must do. We emptied trash rooms and things like that. And then we did no more and we sent them home. Part of that was because we didn't want people congregating, and that was for good reason. The other part of it was we couldn't get PPE. We couldn't keep and get enough masks and hand sanitizer in the spring to handle a crew of 65 people. It just wasn't possible. The hospitals were still stealing everything they could get their hands on. That has since improved, but it's still a challenge to keep PPE in stock, particularly when everybody and their mama wants an N95. And you still can't get N95s, with any good consistency. During the summer, as people came back, we ran a regular summer. We worked hard to keep people in smaller teams, but it's hard to strip and wax floors in singles, in single teams. We had to have people working in close proximity to even give Temple the option to reopen at some of the occupancy levels that they wanted. Some considerations for those of you that are getting ready to open or thinking about opening and you don't have people really in mass on campus right now. Think about workspaces, think about break rooms, cleaning consistency and staffing levels. Redundancy in the case of illness, for our housekeeping side, I think we did have, since the spring, we've had 3 positive cases on our housekeeping team. We had 1 in our maintenance team, but that happened while we were still out, so he did that on his own. But I had to come up with a plan for our facility side on if I lost a HVAC mechanic or a plumber, who was I going to bring in from the outside to do that work because it still needed to be done. Looking at your buildings from an HVAC perspective, that's been discussed a lot in the CDC and in the media. There are buildings with great airflow and getting a lot of fresh air, and there are buildings that don't. And knowing what buildings are capable of and what they can and can't do is really important.
Mhm.
And then thinking differently about meetings and huddles. There are conference rooms that we don't use anymore. I haven't had a in-person staff meeting with my staff since March. I've gone to recorded staff meetings where I'll record a voice file that I can send to all of their cell phones. We're using email where we can use email. And then I try and meet one-on-one with people, in inappropriate spaces with masks on, just to avoid having large groups of people gathering, A, because it's not safe, and B, it looks bad. We're telling students not to do these things, and then they see us as a maintenance staff meeting 25 deep, all together in a space. The first thing that happens is they take a picture and we're on Snapchat and being blown up, and I get a call from the president's office. So we had to be really conscious about the visibility of how we did things as well. Walking spaces was critically important. I remember a point in the summertime where I was going through buildings, trying to get things ready. And I literally called Olin, I called Sheena, I was like, hey, I know that the plan right now is to do this with this building. Have you seen this room? Like, I've got my tape measure out and I'm measuring this space and I can't get 6 feet to work in this space. And literally, Olin came over and walked. Is like, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, this needs to be on someone's radar. I was like, okay, having people walking through spaces and really thinking about what it looks like from the student's perspective and the parent's perspective. It wasn't my call to make, but part of it was, I know that as a parent and I walk in and I'm standing there with my son or my daughter and my roommates, the roommate and their parents are standing there. We're all looking at each other like, how is this going to work? Temple should have thought of this differently. And if you're not walking your buildings and taking out the tape measure and looking at it from their perspective, you're going to get blindsided once everybody arrives and realizes that I can't make 6 feet out of this, or this room looks crazy this way, and you guys should have thought about this differently.
And I would encourage you to do it before you sold the bed, because we
Yeah.
had already sold the beds. So my team had to, poor Mary, who's on this call, had to call these people up and reassign them. And then at that point, it's like, do you even have beds to reassign them to? No, we didn't. But we figured it out through cancellations. But yes, I would say if you could do that stuff before you sell the spaces, definitely do that. We would probably have to, Jackie, if you should probably go to our, should we go to the lessons learned? Because it's kind of,
Yeah, I think let's end on the lessons learned slide and call that our ending slide. So this came from questions that I asked Olin and Shana in prep for the presentation, just to talk about, what things you've learned, what would you do differently? If each of you could pick off your highest level things off this list and kind of walk through it a little bit for folks.
I think I would pick 2. And it kind of goes back to, we use the lessons learned slide, but I would go back to the slide before it as well, because I think it's important. Understanding why decisions were made, how decisions were made, and who was making decisions. It helped us understand a lot better how to position and how to share information with the campus to help people make the most important decisions, but also helped us understand a lot more when decisions did not go in the direction that they went, that we thought they should go, how we positioned our staff to be successful. Money was important, but it was a distant second to image. One of the things most immediately, to give you an example, is that the person that was put in charge of the coronavirus steering effort was our vice president for public affairs. So that sent very clear messages about how the university was looking at these particular issues. Yes, they were looking at the health factor. Yes, they were looking at the money factor, but trying to be sure that they did the right thing in the eyes of the community, in the eyes of the various stakeholders, was the prevailing philosophy. And I think that's really important to understand how things work. If we go back to the lessons learned slide, the other thing I will say is, if we move forward, the other thing I would say is those two bullets, the third bullet from the bottom and the second bullet from the bottom, all combined together to say transparency is important, but how we position our staffs, in the atmosphere of the institution, and also position our staffs to be able to handle some of the questions that they could not answer, to handle some of the frustration from parents as we move forward, was extremely important. We could not avoid that as an agent of the institution. And so positioning ourselves to be able to navigate those things was extremely important.
Extremely quickly, I would just say knowing your housing system and how to manipulate your inventory is going to be wildly important. Especially, and then I think the other piece is about the politics, about do you have the agency to influence outcomes? I said this yesterday, but that is wildly important, because if you don't, then you're quite often going to be in a space where you're going to be responsive. And so unfortunately, student affairs in the world at Temple hadn't carved out enough, I don't want to say clout, but agency in this moment that they could say, no, this is the definitive way that we should do things, versus a whole group of people who had ideas about housing and how things should go, and had ideas about students' experience, and actually weren't the people who engage and interact with students all the time. So really thinking about your political agency and how you are able to influence outcomes is going to be wildly important. And then what allies, if you don't have that agency, what allies at the university can you work through to influence some of those outcomes?
Jackie, if you could take us to the last slide. I know we're out of time, we're a little over. I want to thank all of you for coming. All three of our emails are there on the screen. If you use your phone and your camera feature, or use that link at the bottom, is the link to the survey. If you want to throw more questions in the chat, we will take them and try and get back to you individually. And maybe we need to find another outside of Makuho time to maybe finish up the rest of it if people are really interested in that. But, you know, for all of our efforts, you know, I want to say a big thank you to Olin and to Shana. You know, Olin is a director, Shana is a director, I have been a director. There is no preparation for what has happened at any of our campuses over the last 6+ months, and definitely not in the Temple version of it. There is just no training program. There's no degree that would have helped you do all of this. This has to come down to having good people that make good decisions in the right place at the right time. Mm-hmm. I think Temple has been blessed with a wonderful leadership team. And I think the biggest takeaway from the whole thing is, had they trusted that leadership team to do what they know how to do and to use their experience, it could have gone even better than it did. Thank you very much, all. I don't know how we end at this point, but I hope to see you all at the business meeting, which I think is next.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.